In before my dog interrupts. Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the talk for tonight from the Midland Penetang Field Naturalist Club. As Ken said, I'm the president, Susan Hurst, and we're going to be having a talk tonight on herpetological short stories with David Legros. So really looking forward to that. Another interesting talk where I'm sure we're all going to learn lots of things. Just wanted to let you know that the executive at a meeting just to talk about where things are going to be going in terms of online and in-person meetings for the club. And at this point, the only decision we've made is that we are going to stay online for the next, well, tonight and then for April and May. There'll be online meetings with speakers. And then in June, we have our AGM, and that we are hoping to make an in-person meeting or planning to make it in-person. It's usually held at Tiny Marsh, and it'll be somewhere towards the end of June. We haven't got an exact date yet, but we'll certainly keep you posted on that one. So that would be towards the end of June, and it's also traditionally been a potluck in the past, but that might be a little problematic in these times. So again, we're giving this all some thought. If you have any suggestions or thoughts on this, please get in touch with one of the executive and let us know if you've got any strong feelings one way or the other about the AGM. And then we'll be looking at what we're going to do come the fall. And again, we're still discussing that. So if you have any thoughts on that matter, we'd be happy to hear from you. Okay, I hope everybody enjoyed the beautiful day today. It's certainly nice to get out and have those double digits. And I was out at Tiny Marsh, saw some of the usual suspects, but it was great to see more birds coming back. So with that, I'll pass it over to Ken and he can introduce our speaker for tonight. Ken, you're muted.
Thanks, Susan. Just I trying to find all the right buttons to push here, and I missed that one. I'm just going to find David here and put him up on. Oh no, he doesn't call himself David Legros. What do you call yourself, Dave? Legros Papa or something? No, there you are.
Oh yeah, no, I call myself David.
There he is. So this is David Legros, the chief naturalist at Algonquin Park, and he's a Midland Penetang boy from Lafontaine, right?
That's right, yeah.
From LA, and is that the secret handshake in LA?
Among them, yes.
Okay, but he's made a. Did you start your career at the Y Marsh? Your naturalist career?
Early on, yes. I was at the Y Marsh for just under a year when I was fairly young. It seems like a long time ago now. Yeah, so I had some.
And then you became an Algonquinaut.
That's right.
At most and now he's risen to the highly elevated position of head naturalist at Algonquin Park. And if you go to Algonquin Park, you can usually find David in the visitor center, and you can play Stump the Naturalist with David. What's the toughest question you ever got, David?
Oh, there's been a lot of tough questions. I get some memorable questions, like what time do you let the moose out?
Yeah. Yeah. Or where do you keep the moose?
Yep.
But anyways, that's enough. David, he writes a lot of things in the Raven. I think the Raven is one of the greatest naturalist publications that we have in Ontario. I'm still just admitting a few people here. But I think with that, David, I pinned you, but you have to kind of figure out how to share your screen now. I'm going to unpin myself.
All right.
And you can take over.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Ken. And earlier we did practice this. We figured it out, and I didn't change anything. So this surely won't work the first time. All right, can everybody see my my first slide?
You're good, David.
Okay. So my name is David Legros, and I'm the Chief Park Naturalist in Algonquin Provincial Park. I've been in Algonquin in this capacity for about 8 years, and actually just recently I became one of the assistant superintendents of Algonquin Park. So not a role that I ever would have planned for myself, but here we are. So I have been interested in nature for a very, very long time, and a good day for me is if I can get out to the field and look at something, usually something small, something that piques my curiosity, and I really like. Oh, is there a question?
No, somehow or other we just got a couple people that were unmuted, Dave. They probably muted, but I think I'm going through them. You can keep going.
All right. So being able to go out and look at something like insects or butterflies, plants, reptiles or amphibians, and being able to share that with somebody really makes me happy. So getting a chance to spend some time in the field and sharing my love of nature with people makes me really, really happy. For pretty much my entire life, I have been very, very interested in reptiles and amphibians. I know they're not everybody's favorite, especially snakes. But I found them really, really fascinating. And I think a big part of that was that these were animals that people generally overlooked for a really long time or didn't like, and it sort of drew me to them. So tonight, my presentation was called Herpological Short Stories, Tales from the Field. And just a little bit of background, the word herpetology comes from this Greek word herpeton, meaning creeping animal, and logia meaning knowledge. So herpetology is the knowledge of the creeping animals. And people with an avid interest in herpetology call themselves herpers. So I've been referring to myself as a herper for a very, very long time. So today, I couldn't resist because it is indeed St. Patrick's Day. And this was the day where people would celebrate St. Patrick driving the snakes from Ireland. I thought it was particularly funny that I was doing a talk about reptiles and amphibians. St. Patrick probably didn't drive the snakes from Ireland. It was probably the work of glaciers, but who doesn't like to take credit for somebody else's work and celebrate with a pint? So here we are. So many years ago, so I look for reptiles and amphibians just about everywhere I go. When I was a kid, I had read as much as I could about them and learned that, reptiles and amphibians are usually active at certain temperatures and certain habitats. And what I've been sort of getting at is that, all this information is really good stuff, but the more you look, the more kind of strange stuff you find. And sometimes you find stuff that isn't necessarily in the books. And that's really, really exciting. A number of years ago, I was down on a beach in Rondo Provincial Park, and it was fairly late at night. It was a May evening. It was probably around 11 o'clock at night, which is pretty late for me. And my wife and I were standing on the beach, and we see this toad emerging from the sand. So minutes before, there was nothing but sand, and this toad is popping right out. And it makes me think, what else is going on out here in nature that we can't see just below this very thin surface, this very thin covering of sand, for example? What else is being hidden out there? And if you start looking, you'll start finding some strange things and maybe some really inspirational things. So I've got a number of short stories to tell you about some amphibian and reptile observations that I've made over the past, I guess, decade or so. And these ones were ones that I felt were significant enough to share with the scientific community. So I had taken some photos, measurements, observations, written some careful notes, and eventually published these as short notes in peer-reviewed scientific articles. So I'm really proud of these. None of them are terribly related to each other, apart from they're all about reptiles and amphibians in Ontario. So to continue, just to introduce, what is natural history? To me, this is the really good stuff about nature. Natural history is the research and study of organisms in nature focused on observation rather than experiments. So this is going out and looking at things and trying to see what wildlife and plants do, and try to figure out why they do them, at what times of year they do them, what do they eat, all this great stuff. You know, I had gone through and done my master's at Laurentian University and did some experiments with amphibians and forest roads, trying to rehabilitate forest roads. So that was trying to make observations with measurable responses. And that stuff was really cool and very practical. But getting started with natural history observations to me was is a really great inspiration to try to understand what wildlife do and how they do it. So natural history can be the study of the wheres and whens. It's discovery and documentation about what nature does, and maybe if we're lucky, we can figure out why. So here on the slide, I've got an image of a researcher in Algonquin Park that is looking for nests of a brown creeper. So as many of you might know, brown creepers nest under big chunks of tree bark. So just at about shoulder height on this fella, on the tree, there's a big chunk of tree bark that's peeled off, and there's a brown creeper nest under there. Below that, there's a tray full of study skins of bird specimens. So these are specimens that were found of deceased birds. They were preserved in a way that the wing cord could be measured, the bill, the feet, many other aspects of the birds could be measured to learn a little bit about size, morphology, and the distribution of these birds. And then beside that, I've got this map with red, green, and yellow squares. And this is the distribution of northern two-line salamanders in my part of the world. So at that Parry Sound, Muskoka area. So it's just, where do things live, and when do we find them? Things like that. What do they eat? How long do they live? Basic things about wildlife, just to try to figure out the simple things about them. So, do we know everything about wildlife that lives around us? And the answer, I think, is pretty obvious to everybody. It's not even close. Figuring out what they eat, when, how many young do they have, how far do they move, how long do they live, where do they live, how far north? There are tons of questions, and they still need answers. There's still a lot of work to be done. Nature is really good to us in that way. As soon as one question gets answered, it poses two more. So if you're really curious about nature and natural history, there's always lots to learn. So I think about today and how biologists are trained. Oh, I think I maybe missed a slide. Oh, uh-oh. All right. So I took this photo a couple years ago, and this is a garter snake, and it's actually living in one of the old stone barbecue pits along Highway 60 in Algonquin Park. And I saw this garter snake living in the crack in the rocks here. The part where the fire would be is actually much, much higher up, so the snake's not in any danger. But there's also a number of shed skins around here. And it really looked like a number of snakes had actually come to this very spot to shed their skins. So it was this really interesting observation about snakes going to a communal spot to do something very interesting that they easily could go out and do by themselves. But there's something about this spot that really attracted them to it. So thinking about how biologists are trained today, there's many ways that we can learn, although a big way that the people used to learn was by going out and learning from other people in camps. There's lab work that people can do, and again, learning from instructors and other successful people in their field, and then training those people to a point where they can actually go out and execute work of their own. So just like the two guys in the boat in the bottom, they've reached a certain level of their studies where they're capable of leading their own research projects. If we think back to a very, very long time ago, so these are some cave paintings from France that are reportedly very, very old, like 20, 30,000 years old. There was a time where everybody was a natural historian. Everybody was a practical biologist because they needed to be. They were nature worshipers. They relied on nature for food, for survival. So it was really important that people had a very intimate knowledge of natural history. Today, things are a little bit different. So we think about the way that we maybe learn about nature. And for many people, it could become a bit of an abstraction. You might learn about nature and natural history or biology in a lecture hall like this one. I spent a lot of time in this particular lecture hall. It's the Wenjack Theater at Trent University. I learned a lot of great things, met a lot of really interesting people here, but I certainly did not see any moss out in nature in this lecture hall. I didn't see any birds flying overhead, and I certainly didn't see any salamanders crawling around between the benches. So we can think of a couple of pretty great biologists here. I've got these two. They're two insatiable naturalist scientists. We've got Charles Darwin here, and we've got salamander slammer Patrick Muldown on the other side. Only one of these was a poor student, but both of these guys, I'm very, very sure, spent a lot of time looking out the window. Eventually, their windows would become very, very large, and what one of them saw would really upend science. And it was this really excellent marriage of natural history observations helping to develop big theories. So I said one of them would upend science, though the other one is catching up. But as a matter of course, in most university and college courses, natural history isn't something that's being taught. It's something that you have to teach yourself. And I will encourage everybody to go out and teach themselves as much as they can, and really let your curiosity ride. So Aldo Leopold, one of our heroes in conservation, he said, "Is education possibly a process of trading awareness for things of lesser worth?" And he says, "The goose who trades his is soon a pile of feathers." And as the birds come back from migration right now, we can definitely maybe put this one into perspective. We might find that pile of feathers of a bird who wasn't paying attention. So today, I'm not knocking formal education, but I'm making a plea for balance and encouraging people, anybody, students or anybody, to go out and spend time in nature to learn directly from it. So tonight, I want to emphasize that you don't need to know everything, but learning and discovery is really fun, and it's an amazing human trait. It's something we all have innate in us that we want to do. And you never know where it will lead you, and everyone has the capacity to make a discovery. And you don't need to know everything, but approaching life with, curiosity, and suddenly the world becomes very, very rich. And I want people to be curious. So chapter 1 tonight features that beautiful little golden salamander. So way back in 2007, I was a university student and I needed a summer job, and I landed a summer job as a student in Algonquin Provincial Park as a park naturalist. And I was really excited to be in that part of the world because this animal here, I had never seen one before. The parts of Ontario where I had lived before, so Penetang Midland, does not have northern two-line salamanders. And I was very, very excited at the prospect of maybe getting a chance to see one of these guys. And they've got a sort of interesting distribution in Ontario. It's primarily in that southern shield region of Ontario. So from that Kingston Frontenac access to the Ottawa area to sort of southern, the central part of Georgian Bay, but generally on Canadian Shield and the Algonquin Park area. So I grew up where the Red Star was in Lafontaine, and then I was spending the summer up in Algonquin Park, right in the thick of the range of the two-line salamander. So I was pretty excited. So I would go out and I would look in likely habitat for these salamanders. So these are these little rocky streams. So this is something that's fairly uncommon in Midland Penetang, where you are and where I'm from. Seeing these little streams that are very rocky, generally pretty clear, and there could be lots of these streams throughout the woods. So I went out and started looking in these little streams to see what I could find. So it didn't take very, very long of turning over rocks and logs to find one of these little salamanders. And I've got an image of this one. It's tucked up beside a piece of birch that was laying against a mossy rock. So I was pretty excited. So I decided to convince my friends to go out at night. And, we were all pretty young at the time, and going out for nighttime adventures to look for salamanders. This is perhaps the geekiest late night activity you could do with your friends. But we went out with our flashlights and headlamps, and I brought a petri dish and some calipers and decided to look for the salamanders and collect a few and measure them, and then sort of detail what they were doing. So we'd gone out over 4 nighttime surveys in the summer of 2007. So the 23rd of June to late August. So we went from like high black flies and mosquitoes to almost no biting flies at night. Generally, we went out on warm, rainy nights and we searched the creek. So instead of going out and flipping rocks during the day like I had done, we went out at night just to see if we could see the animals, just doing regular salamander stuff. And we didn't have to flip any rocks. So looking carefully with our headlamps and flashlights, we could see the animals crawling around on rocks, on moss, and some of them were doing something particularly interesting. So I noticed that some of these salamanders, they had actually climbed up on vegetation, so ferns and shrubs and small trees that were growing on the side of the creek. So the little creek is maybe 50 centimeters wide, a meter wide, something like that. There's rocks and moss, and then there's vegetation growing along the banks. So we were looking on the rocks and logs and stuff that was in the middle of the creek, and then 1 meter on each side. So we had some methods set out, and then we were just checking the vegetation and checking the rocks and stuff there. And we ended up finding many salamanders, both on the ground and on the vegetation. So I took careful notes about where and what I found. And it turned out, of all the salamanders we found, I think there was a total of 19 on these 4 surveys. So it's not a huge number, but it was enough to pique my curiosity, that over half of them were actually up on the vegetation. So I've got some statistics down here, but all this to say that there was no difference in the number of animals I found on the ground versus the ones I found up on the vegetation. So this was actually kind of an interesting place to find these guys, and trying to figure out what they were doing up there was pretty exciting. So it's thought that the salamanders were up on the vegetation to find food. And you could imagine that if you have a very, very messy house, so if you think about your home like a forest floor, you could have lots of leaves and sticks and twigs and moss, all that stuff. And you can imagine that like your clothes and debris and empty pizza boxes and stuff like that everywhere. And you have lost your keys, or you're looking for small prey like small insects. It could be very difficult to find them on the forest floor like that. But if you have a nice clean countertop, it's very, very easy to find whatever you left on the counter if there's nothing else on there, like your keys or maybe a small spider. So it's thought that the salamanders were climbing up on top of the vegetation to eat insects. Even though there might not be as many of them up on the plants, they are much easier to find on the plants than they were in the duff and leaf litter. So this ended up being a newly described behavior in this species. Other species of salamanders that live nearby have been documented doing this, but not this particular species. So this was actually pretty exciting. And this was like one of my first scientific discoveries. I was pretty excited. So staying with those 2-line salamanders, many years later, I had the opportunity to go back to Algonquin Park to do my graduate research on amphibians and forest roads in the park's backcountry. And as students are prone to do while you're working, you're working hard installing pitfall traps and things like that. You eventually take a break and you have lunch, and then you start looking, around you out in the woods, and we noticed this little creek. So we thought, oh, well, we'll go look for 2-line salamanders in the creek. I'm researching amphibians, so if I know that there's some down there, they might eventually end up on the road where I'm looking for them. So let's have a peek. So again, we're back to these rocks that are partly submerged in water. They've got water flowing over them. They've got moss on them. So we decided to actually look under a few of the rocks. And to my surprise, I couldn't even believe it. We found some salamander eggs under 2 different rocks, but under this one particular rock, we found many, many eggs. And in total, I counted 165 eggs. And to me, this was a lot. And I would later find out that female 2-line salamanders can lay at most 100 eggs, and it's usually quite a bit less than that. So I was thinking, oh, well, is there like a really giant salamander that laid all these eggs, or what's happening? So it turns out that what happened here was that it was a communal nesting site for those two-line salamanders. So at least 2 female salamanders, and potentially even more, had gone to that one spot to lay their eggs. And they lay their eggs under these rocks. There's cool, fresh water always bathing over them, providing oxygen for the developing larvae. And they grow, and eventually they'll emerge from the egg and they swim off. So at this spot, we had 2 females at least that had laid eggs in that same spot. And to many researchers, that suggests that there might be a lack of good spots in the creek, like it's sort of really the perfect spots for them to lay their eggs. And it's possible that maybe there's other reasons to do this. So we know that, for example, female common mergansers will collect the broods of other female common mergansers, so that if a predator attacks like this big bunch of mergansers, that there's a good chance that it's not the original female's chicks that get eaten, but maybe her neighbor's chicks that get eaten. So by having many broods of salamanders in the same spot, maybe it deflects some predators from the initial female. So anyway, this was the first record of communal oviposition, so egg laying in two-line salamanders in Ontario. And this was pretty exciting too. Two-line salamanders are reasonably common throughout much of their range in Ontario, but we know almost nothing about them here. They're well studied in the US, but researchers in Canada haven't really bothered to study them. So I was pretty excited to contribute to our knowledge of two-line salamanders here. So I think it was also that year, I happened to be up at the visitor center, so where you might come by and see me today. When I was a student, I ended up wandering around behind the visitor center and flipping rocks again. Surprise, surprise, right? Instead of being in a creek, this was in an open clearing with lots of lichens and lots of flat rocks, things like that. And I found some ringneck snakes rather. And these are an amazing little snake. If ever you have a chance to see one, they're about the size of a pencil. They're maybe 30 centimeters long at most. They're a beautiful bluish gray color. They've got a nice yellowy orange ring around the neck and sort of a dark head and very clean, sort of pale cream colored lips. Very, very handsome little snake. Now, you notice that this image does not depict a snake. It actually depicts a dead chipmunk with a large glossy black and orange beetle on it. And this is a carrion beetle, and or a burying beetle, as many people like to call them. These are among my favorite beetles because, growing up as a kid, if I found a carcass somewhere and I turned it over, so like roadkill, like a squirrel or something like that, there would often be 1 or 2 of these beetles on it underneath. And burying beetles are a particularly fascinating beetle because they exhibit parental care, which is pretty remarkable for insects. And they do a pretty interesting thing where the male and female, they detect a carcass by sensing the gases emitted from this carcass using their antenna. And they will fly, they'll land next to the carcass, and they'll hopefully meet a male or female to complete the pair. And they will decide to work together to churn the soil underneath the carcass, and that carcass will sink into the soil. They will fend off any flies that might lay their eggs on the carcass. So they will kill off maggots or eat the fly larvae. And they will put secretions all over this carcass to reduce its rate of decay. So they've got some antimicrobial properties to some of their secretions. They work to remove the hair from the carcass, and then they shape it into a bit of a donut. So if you imagine that it's an elongated carcass, they'll sort of fold it and make it into a little bit of a donut. And then they will lay their eggs inside that donut. And then when their larvae hatch, their larvae beg, just like a baby bird, and they want their parents to come by and feed them chewed up bits of the dead mouse or squirrel that they've buried for them. They're really, really remarkable beetles. And they're definitely one of my favorites. We've got about 8 different species that live in our part of Ontario. They're super beautiful. If ever you catch a mouse in a mouse trap in your house and you'd like to see one of these, put it out in your lawn, put a piece of a board over top of it for a day or 2 and go back and flip it, and you'll eventually find one of these carrion beetles underneath. So do give that a try. So I just told you some amazing stuff about these carrion beetles. Now I've got some images to show you in case you didn't believe me. So when I was living with my parents for a short amount of time, many years ago, I actually reared some carrion beetles in the woodshed because they weren't allowed in the house. You kind of wonder why. I actually got to witness this all firsthand myself. So this is inside an applesauce jar, and we've got the adult female beetle visible in the upper image, that donut of the carcass, and then the larvae inside the middle of the donut. And then in the lower image, you can actually see how big the larvae are. So this was a really incredible thing to watch. And it didn't actually smell that bad. My dad is a germaphobe, and he even got pretty close to this and he didn't detect any smell. And he claims to be a super smeller. So what does this all have to do with that ringneck snake that I told you about? Well, if anybody's got a family big enough, there's always a black sheep in any family. And in that family of burying beetles, there is definitely a black sheep, and it is Nycrophorus pustulatus, the pustulated burying beetle. And this is it here. And it's primarily a black colored beetle, and it has a couple of very small orange marks on the back end of its elytra, the wing covers. So this beetle isn't really attracted to carrion. It's attracted to lights at night, but not unlike moths. And it's never really been observed breeding in the wild. And in the lab, you can kind of force them to breed on carrion, but they don't really like it. They don't do very well. And many years ago, it was actually discovered that they prey on black rat snakes. And you're thinking, well, David, the beetle's about the size of my thumbnail, and the black rat snake is the biggest snake that we have in Ontario. How does it prey on rat snakes? Well, there's a very vulnerable life stage for the beetle, or for the snake rather, and it is when it is an egg. So these burying beetles have host shifted from carcasses like all the other beetles in that family, and they have shifted to snake eggs. And this was a very big discovery, because it meant that we had a beetle that was actually preying on snakes, and this was a very unusual thing. So it was discovered in Ontario that the black rat snakes were being parasitized by these burying beetles, and this was a pretty big deal in the science community, especially because black rat snakes in Ontario are a protected species. They're declining in many parts of the range here. Probably not due to beetles, most likely habitat loss and road mortality, but this might be a concern. So I was flipping rocks at the visitor center that one day, and I came across these larvae that I immediately recognized as burying beetle larvae. And this was in a spot where I knew that there were ringneck snakes, and I had found these eggs about a month before, and I had gone back to look at them. And there was a brood of ringneck snake eggs here, and you can actually still see the remains of the eggs between all the beetles. They look like they're in pretty gross shape, but there were many eggs there, and they've been consumed by these beetles. And I actually caught an adult female pustulated burying beetle at that spot. So this was this was really exciting for me, because I'd studied these beetles for a long time and knew about this behavior where they parasitize black rat snakes, but had not, suspected it in other species. And sure enough, there they were. So these little tiny ringneck snakes, they actually lay pretty big eggs. The adult female can lay maybe 3 to 5, well, maybe 2 to 5 of these eggs. And they're a significant proportion of the female's body weight, because they're such a small snake, and their young hatch out and they're already, 8 centimeters long, which is pretty big in comparison to a 30-centimeter snake. And they also might lay their eggs communally under a rock. So there might be many females that lay their eggs in one spot. There's records of up to 30 eggs being found in one spot, and this is certainly from many females laying their eggs at that one place. So thinking about these snakes, or about these beetles, I had known that they had a range that was much bigger than that of black rat snakes in North America. So they must be feeding on other snake eggs or doing something else in other places. So pretty much wherever they are found, these beetles are found in North America. There are other egg-laying snakes, although they haven't been recorded on those snakes. But this this observation of the ringneck snakes being parasitized by Necrophorus pustulatus was only the second species described as being a host for the burying beetle. So to me, this was really exciting, and it's adding to our understanding of how these beetles live and some of the threats to some of these snakes. So speaking of snakes, I know they're not everybody's favorite, but I love them. So a number of years ago, and my wife Courtney and I, we'd actually gone down to Rondo Provincial Park, and maybe many of you will be heading south for spring migration to see birds migrating back from Central and Tropical America. And we did this. We spent 4 days down there in mid-May around Mother's Day, which was really exciting. We definitely saw lots and lots of great birds, including this beautiful prothonotary warbler at Rondo Provincial Park. And we had gone for a bike ride, so it was nice to leave the car behind, go for a bike ride down the trail, get out to the point, and on our way back, we were checking out some of the birds, taking lots of photos. Really had a beautiful day. And then on the way back towards our campsite, I find this beautiful brown snake, DeKay's brown snake, on the trail. And a DeKay's brown snake is maybe about 30 centimeters in length. It's another pretty small snake. They feed mostly on invertebrates like snails and slugs, and maybe worms. So they're pretty small. They're pretty vulnerable to just about any small predator. So even like a short-tailed shrew will eat one. Robin will certainly eat one. Mid-sized predators like raccoons, foxes, and skunks definitely eat them. A bullfrog will certainly eat one. So just about anything will eat one of these small snakes. So they're pretty defenseless, we'll say. They're not venomous. They don't taste bad, really, although they might defecate on themselves to, make them appear unpalatable. But, not too many defenses. So I put the snake back on the ground to take some photos of it, and I start noticing that it's crawling away from me, and it has created this broad loop. So you can see the snake's head sort of in the middle of the image, and it created this broad loop, and it started slithering away from me, but it was swaying this big loop side to side. And I suspect that this was actually a distraction technique. So it was maybe trying to make itself look larger than it actually was, potentially confusing a predator like myself. I was certainly confused, and maybe drawing attention away from its head. So a less vital part of the body, making it look like its head was much bigger and somewhere that wasn't its actual head. So this was pretty interesting. And so I took a bunch of pictures, and I got home and I started doing a bit of a literature search about brown snakes and how they protect themselves. So it turns out that small snakes have way more defensive tactics than larger snakes. So if you think about a snake like a milk snake, for example, one of my favorites, it's got a beautiful camouflage pattern, making it maybe a little bit harder to find. If you do happen to find a milk snake, it will do a couple of different things. It will rattle its tail in dry leaves to make a buzzing sound, to maybe make you think that it's a rattlesnake and leave it alone. So it's using deception. And then if you really don't leave it alone, it may bite you if you do happen to pick it up. It's not likely to strike at you if you don't touch it. And then if you do happen to pick it up, it will probably defecate on you or itself. It smells bad. And if it smells bad, it tastes bad. So you should probably put it down. So it's got a few different tactics there. But brown snakes actually have a lot more defensive techniques. So they definitely defecate on themselves. They might strike, but they're pretty small, so it's pretty not a very meaningful defense tactic. Sometimes they flatten themselves right out, so they'll flatten their bodies from being sort of round like this, and they'll flatten themselves out to be ribbon-like, to make themselves look bigger. Sometimes they even curl up their lip, kind of like Elvis, to maybe appear more aggressive. They might flash their tongue a little bit, and it's two different colors that might be distracting for a predator. So but having this this other defensive display, so that swaying coil was adding to this body of work of what these small snakes do to defend themselves. That had only been documented once in one other snake, and it was one that was nearly frozen. The author said that it was about 0 degrees Celsius out, and he had found the snake, and he was holding it, and it was doing it in his hand. So this was the first time a free-moving, sort of normally active snake had been documented doing that. So that was an exciting thing to observe too. All right, so we're winding down to getting towards the end of the presentation here. So I've got one last chapter or one last story to tell before we get to the conclusion. This one's one of my favorite ones. So if you're like me, you're probably looking forward to the lakes and rivers thawing out. Maybe they've already thawed out where you are, but this is what I really look forward to in the coming months. Here is liquid water, going out for a paddle with my wife Courtney on our way to an awesome campsite. So we get to our campsite and we set up our tent and we make some food and we start looking for wildlife and just really enjoying the scenery. That's all really great. And you know, if you've set up your campsite nicely, you've made some food, and one of the things you need to do once you get to a campsite in Algonquin Park, you know, you got to satisfy your hunger. You got to make sure your shelter's set up, and you know, made your bed and all that stuff. But eventually, you need to go to the bathroom. And in Algonquin Park's backcountry, we have, and here's a fun stat for you guys. There's over 2,000 of these in the backcountry. We call them thunder boxes, but these are our outdoor privies that are in the backcountry. So shortly after getting to the campsite, I go to find this. You know, it's always good to know where the bathrooms are, right? So I open the lid, and underneath the lid, I've got 2 different photos here, but there was a salamander under the lid of the toilet. And, you know, many people might not appreciate that, but, you know, herpetology is where you find it. And I found this salamander. It was under the lid, and I thought, oh, this is really curious. I've never seen that before. And you think, okay, well, the thunderbox is, you know, it's 50 centimeters tall from the ground, and it's straight-sided. So this little creature had to climb straight up the side of this thing, then get under the lid, and maybe it got lost and it's up there, you know, by accident. So I scooped the salamander up using a leaf, and I moved him about 2 meters away. And I said, all right, good luck. You know, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. So I went back the following morning because I needed to. I had, you know, needs. And the salamander, amazingly, had returned to the exact same spot within certainly under 24 hours, probably 16 hours, something like that. So it had returned that 2 meters of distance, which isn't really far for us, but when you're about this big, that's pretty far. And it scaled the vertical side of that thunderbox to get back under the lid there, back to the exact same spot. Redback salamanders like this one are very territorial. So once they've got a really good territory, they're very defensive of it, and you could move them away from it and they'll come right back. So to me, this suggested that this animal was getting a lot of what it needed by living under the lid of the toilet. So it had shelter. So it was fairly high humidity under there, and which was good. And there was food. So when you lift up the lid to these thunder boxes, there's often a profusion of these little tiny flies that fly out of there. We can only imagine what they're feeding on there, but I suspect that the salamander may have been feeding on those flies. And so I've got this triangle here. It's a shelter, food, and mates. I didn't see another salamander here, so maybe there weren't any mates living under the toilet lid with it. But at least it's got 2 of the points covered off. So these salamanders are pretty territorial. To me, it suggested that was probably a good territory, and it was worth the risk of coming all the way back over that fairly long journey up a pretty steep side to get back to that spot. So that indicated that that climbing behavior, which isn't well documented in many small salamanders, that homing behavior, so coming back after having been displaced, and then using something that people put in a landscape as a territory, as a really important part of its home range, and then making use of a food source that you know, probably wouldn't be there if people weren't depositing it there. So I got that little story published, or that note published in the Canadian Field Naturalist, and I'm pretty sure that that is the only time that the word thunderbox has been published in that peer-reviewed journal, and a lot of people like to point that out to me. So it brings us to the conclusion of all these herpological short stories. And so what? What does it all mean? Well, really, at the end of the day, the more you look, the more you find. Nature's full of little mysteries, and if you take time to look and to do a little bit of research, you can actually learn quite a bit about it and maybe make some discoveries of yourself. All these add to a body of knowledge. And when I was doing my grad work, my master's supervisor said, David, you can't make a career of natural history observations. And for a scientist in, you know, a university or an academic situation, that is pretty true. But for me, where I'm at, I really like making these. It adds to a body of knowledge. And these little observations, they certainly don't necessarily mean a lot. They're not like an experiment or anything like that. But really what it is, it's a small piece of the puzzle. And as we all know, big puzzles are made up of a lot of small pieces, and you need most of them to complete the picture. I don't think nature is ever going to give up all the pieces or let us look at the box, but it keeps it really interesting, and it's something that we can keep working on. So anybody can make these discoveries. You just need to know what you're looking at, kind of. Your curiosity will help fill in a lot of the rest, and you know, talking to other people about things that they've observed can go a long way. So why do reptiles and amphibians matter? So they're vital links in our food web. So they eat a lot of invertebrates, a lot of other animals. Most of them are predators, and they in turn get eaten by a lot of other creatures as well. So they're an important link. Let's say frogs. Their tadpoles are in the water, so they grow up in the water and then they move to the land. So it's this movement of nutrients from an aquatic habitat to a terrestrial habitat, and then potentially back into an aquatic habitat as breeding adults. A lot of them have specific habitat needs and exacting requirements. So as our world changes, some of these habitat requirements might change as well, and it could lead to impacts on reptile and amphibian populations. There's a lot of stuff that we don't even know about, and that's why I want everybody to keep an open mind and consider making observations of their own. Sometimes behaviors evolve over time under different conditions. So as salamanders are put into places or are in places with human structures, for example, maybe they figure out how to take advantage of these. And many of our reptiles and amphibians in Ontario are becoming rare, and as their species at risk, we need to conserve them because we might lose them forever. So what can we do? So there's stuff that we can all do in our day-to-day lives, especially now that spring's coming, to help care for amphibians and reptiles, even in our own backyard. So one of the things that you can do is try citizen science. So if you happen to make an observation of an amphibian or reptile or any species of wildlife or any kind of plant, animal, fungus here in Ontario or anywhere in the world. So there were a couple of members that were recently in Costa Rica or in Texas. So you can submit observations anywhere in the world to iNaturalist. So this is an amazing online community science platform where if you've got a picture of the animal and you can figure out the location, you can submit to this. And it's a great way to help scientists understand the natural history, the distribution, and the seasonal occurrence of wildlife or plants or fungus where we live. So I've got an image of somebody taking an image of some orange jelly fungus on a balsam fir tree. And then I've got a map of two-line salamanders here in Ontario just below that. So to help the herps, there's a few things that we can do. So we can protect habitats. Even small pieces can help. So places like the tiny marsh are an amazing place to protect. Maintaining natural shorelines at cottages, leaving native vegetation, or saving a wetland from development or an invasive species is a really great way. Preventing the establishment of those invasive species is really important. Removal of non-native plants can also help promote healthy habitats. avoid using harmful products and consider what they're made of where and what happens to them when you're done with them. Harmful chemicals do have a time and place, but careful use is key, I think. For example, road salt is often bad for amphibians and reptiles, although we do need it to keep our roads safe for us to be on them. Speaking of roads are pretty brutal for reptiles and amphibians. They get squished, smushed, smeared, and schmucked all over the place. And maybe there's opportunity to avoid driving on roads at times of year and locations where amphibians and reptiles might be really active. And today we build better roads in Ontario in better places and fitting roads with amphibian and reptile crossing tunnels or wildlife tunnels and barriers to keep animals off of the road. So these are good things to do as good practices in the future. So like many of you, I've been cooped up in my house in pandemic mode for over 2 years now. I've been working from home on and off for a good part of that. I've got this image of myself here pretending to work from home on a laptop out in the woods, in a lawn chair and in shorts, but pretending to be dressed up in business formal. So last spring, so about just under a year ago, Courtney and I went out, my wife Courtney and I, we went out to look for amphibians out on a rainy night in April. And we weren't disappointed. So just around the corner, we're going to have the opportunity to go out and look for these things again. So we went to a quiet road just south of Huntsville, like just outside of town. And we started walking the road with our headlamps and started looking for amphibians. And we weren't disappointed. We found dozens and dozens of amphibians on this night. It was raining and about 10 degrees Celsius. We found 74 spring peepers crossing the road, 4 toads, 13 green frogs, 3 wood frogs, 25 redback salamanders crossing the road. I've never seen so many salamanders crossing the road, or redback salamanders crossing the road all at one time. They usually don't move very far at all because they're very territorial, but these ones were on the move to get to something. They breed in the woods, so they're not necessarily migrating to a pond. So again, this was mysterious. And we found 14 four-toed salamanders crossing the road that night. This is a species that I've only ever seen maybe 6 before that night, and they've all been by themselves. And that night we found 14 of them crossing the road. I couldn't believe it. So there's always more to learn about these amazing creatures if we go out and look. And it's worth getting a little bit cold out and missing playoff hockey. So I really want to encourage everybody to go out, stay curious, and maybe flip that rock or log and have a look, or pay attention to your little creature neighbors, whoever they might be. And with that, I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight and listening to me speak about these really amazing creatures. And I'm here to take some questions for a little bit, should there be any. But very much, Midland Penetang Field Naturalists.
That was fantastic, David. I think, yeah, if you've stopped sharing, that's great. I'm just going to pin myself here too. And I say, there's just a couple of questions in the chat, but if you've come up with other questions, put them in there. Well, we still got David on the line. But those are some great stories. You're a good storyteller. You've had a lot of practice, I guess.
Maybe a little bit, yeah.
But let's see. I always take the. By the way, one thing for the club members, you sung the praises of Patrick Moldowan. How did you say it? Moldowan or Moldowan?
Moldowan, yeah.
Moldowan. And Patrick was one of the speakers that we had to cancel at the very beginning of 2020. And we are definitely going to get him, probably in 2022. I've already spoken to him, and but you keep him pretty busy doing field work in Algonquin, so we have to, if we can't get him here in person, we're going to get him on Zoom in the near future, because I understand. Well, is he a good presenter?
He's an amazing presenter. Yeah,
that's what I've heard.
He's finishing up his doctorate right now, so he's very, very busy. But he'll hope actually, he probably won't actually have that much spare time after he's done, but he might have slightly more after that. So make sure to get him. He's amazing.
Good, we would definitely will. And there's a lot of questions coming in, but I might just ask you, and I don't know how much you want to go on about this, but do you want to talk a little bit, first about how you find snakes and salamanders, and maybe a little bit about the ethics of looking for and when you find snakes and salamanders?
All right, so that's actually a great question, Ken. So usually when I go out and find snakes, as a younger fella, I definitely flipped a lot of rocks and logs and looked for them like very, very intensely. As I've matured a little bit, I've decided that, as much as I would like to see the snakes, I've decided there's a lot of rocks and logs that I'll just leave alone and be satisfied knowing that there's probably a snake under it, or hope that there's one there. If I'm doing actual field work where I need to go out and actually document things, I will do that. But if I'm going out for fun, I will probably leave a lot alone. Most of the time, I like going out at times when there's a good chance of me seeing the animals. Maybe just going out with the flashlight or walking a road at a good time of day or night, and hoping to encounter them without having to flip a rock or a log, for example. But every now and then, yeah, I can't really help myself. So if you do happen to find a snake or a salamander, for example, under a rock or a log, you can carefully pick the animal up, move it aside. If you're going to take some photos, that's great. Handle it very, very gently. If you are handling salamanders or frogs, for example, wet hands are really important. Salts and oils on our skin are really bad for their skin. So they take in salts, oils, things like that through their skin. So I imagine anything that touches their skin is probably like anything touching our eyeball. They probably don't like it. So avoid handling them if you can. Wet hands are important. And then if they were under a rock, put the rock back and then put them back right next to the rock. Don't try to stick them back under, or don't try to put the rock back down on top of them, because you could easily crush them. But put them right back next to their house. Imagine, an alien steals you from your home. You probably appreciate being put back, at your front door anyway, right? When the ordeal's over.
That's great. Well, we got a lot of questions here. We'll see how many we can get through in the next 10 or 12 minutes or so.
Okay.
And you can also, again, you can unmute and ask your question in person, but there's also, if you look under reactions, there's usually a prompt there that says raise hand. You can do that too, and then I'll be sure to notice that you want to ask a question. And once we're due with the question period, we usually hang around and we'll be sharing some other things with members, some of the members' photos. But let's get to the questions. Now, somebody mentioned they've seen dung beetles in Africa similar to carrion beetles. I guess they're both beetles, but how similar are they?
I don't think they're not closely related. So the dung beetles, they're a type of scarab beetle, and the berry beetles are a type of sylphid beetle. So they're not terribly closely related.
Bob Codd has raised his hand. We got a couple raised hands here, so let's go to them first. I'm going to pin Bob Codd. There you go, Bob. Are you unmuted?
Now I am.
Yep.
My question for David is, given that you're a local boy and being really fascinated by your experience on the rainy night on a local road, could you suggest suitable roads in our area where I might be able to do that on a rainy April evening?
Or is that ethical to send all 70 of us to that same road?
Well, that actually might be better than everybody going to 70 different roads. So the area around the tiny marsh might be pretty good, but there's a lot of agricultural land there. When I was young, a spot that I would actually go to fairly often, my dad, actually, my dad's not necessarily a herper, but he called me last year when I was out looking for salamanders, and he said he was out and he was doing something else, but they were driving around at night and they found all of these salamanders down near Thunder Beach. So wooded areas in the springtime, so let's say from mid-April to mid-May, on those warm rainy nights where there's a nice wooded area where there might be vernal pools, so these small ponds filling with meltwater. Anywhere that has those around would be really good. The area around Awenda Park has been good in the past. Tiny Beaches Road, it's a long road, but below that ancient Nipissing beach ridge. So you've got the beach at Lafontaine, and then you've got a wooded area, and then it goes up to the top of that hill, and then it's all farm fields. The area below the hill has been pretty good to me in the past. Yeah, those are. I don't have any hot spots to give away at the moment, but there are quite a few good spots around it.
I guess sometimes checking Naturalist might point you in a few spots as well.
But, yeah.
I know Gaia Seagrim, who I believe is on the call tonight, she's out there with Thunder Beach Pop. Maybe we need another visit out to her property. I got a couple of more raised hands here. Let's see if I can find them. How do we do that? Let's see. While I look for them, I'll go to another question here on the side. Dorothy's asking if you know anything about carrion beetles being used in forensics.
Yeah,
something like that.
So there's two main groupings of carrion beetles. So they're the burying beetles that I showed, and they're a small carcass specialist, typically under 300 grams, which, if you're a police investigator, you're generally not too interested in, things under 300 grams. But there's other types of carrion beetles like the American burying beetle and the Isoptoma novabarensis. So those ones go after much bigger carcasses, and they generally get there pretty quick. So they can be used for forensic investigation, but they're maybe not as good as like flies and counting the instars and things like that. But they can be, yes.
Okay, we found a raised hand here. Let's pin. Not sure who this is. We'll have to figure out who it is. If you unmute, you can ask your question. You got your hand raised. Is this Garrett? You have to unmute yourself there.
Looking at TCL there?
TCL, yeah.
Yeah, my name's Michael Lee, and I'm the president of Landmark Cruises. We're from Tobermory, but we're new to the Penetanguishene and Honey Harbor and Midland Biosphere area.
Now, Michael's going to be taking us all over to Georgian Bay Islands this summer.
That's right. That's exactly right. So we have the ship that used to be called the Miss Midland, and we'll be operating that one out of Penetanguishene, and we're into the biosphere. And we're also working with the township of Georgian Bay, Honey Harbor, the council there, and we're talking to operate a shuttle from their new dock over to Bosley Island. So we're working on the Bosley Island side with Parks Canada we're applying for a permit to operate this shuttle. But I've heard that there are more amphibians and snakes in the southern part of Bosley Island than there are in any other national park in Canada. And I'm wondering if, David, that was a great presentation. I really enjoyed that. Animals that you were showing us here, the reptiles and the amphibians, are these typical of what we would or a visitor would see in the southern part of Bosley Island? And would they see them? Are there any other wildlife that they would see there?
So the diversity, so what you're saying is the diversity of amphibians and reptiles on Bosley Island is higher than any other national park in Canada, and that is definitely true. And basically it is a herpetological hotspot for Canada. That southern shore, southeastern shore of Georgian Bay has incredible reptile and amphibian diversity, even though it's not in the most southerly part or the warmest part of Ontario. I spent a summer living and working on Bosley Island, so I'm fairly familiar with the reptiles and amphibians found there. There's five-lined skinks, Ontario's only lizard. There are hognose snakes, fox snakes, milk snakes, water snakes, smooth green snakes, brown snakes, Decay's brown snakes, a little bit like we talked about today. ribbon snakes, garter snakes, ringneck
Yeah.
snakes, and the famous Massasauga rattlesnake. So I've seen most of them on the island. There's, I think, 5 species of turtles on the island, which is pretty incredible. Most of the amphibians that we talked about are on the island. I'm not sure about the two-line salamanders. Their distribution is not terribly well known. And I see I didn't know David Seaburn was going to be on this call, and he's an expert on reptiles and amphibians in Canada. But the distribution of two-line salamanders is not really well known in some parts of Ontario. It wouldn't surprise me if they were there, although I don't think the stream habitat is terribly common on the island.
Just on the island, I think, sorry, it's Michael, right?
Michael, yeah, Mike.
They were saying that, I mean, Bullseye Island is very different from in the south and the north.
Mm-hmm.
More diversity in the south part of the island than the north, or vice versa?
For me, it's hard to say. Some of these snakes will move like considerable distance. Like a fox snake might move 20 kilometers over the course of the summer. To me, like the north end of the island has more of that Canadian Shield feel to it, and that's generally, it seems to be better for herps than it does sort of sandy soils like the Penetang Peninsula, which doesn't have a lot of those same species.
Okay, thanks, Michael.
Yeah, well, my just if I can just take one more
Sure.
addition to that question, I'm curious to know what the visitor we haven't been over there yet. I've never been to Bosley Island, but I'm sure we're going to be there a lot this year. But my question is, what would the visitor experience there be like as far as finding and viewing some of these reptiles and amphibians and other wildlife that might be there? Would people actually see these species?
It happens, yeah. You'll probably see water snakes around the dock. You might happen to see a rattlesnake on the trail. A big part of this, though, it really depends on who is there, right? So when I'm out birding, I can be with a group of people, and if they're not interested in birds, it's like they can't hear them, they don't see them, and like they'll come to Algonquin Park. Oh, we didn't see any animals. Like, well, did you hear the 150 species of birds that were singing, within earshot of you the whole time? Or
Yeah.
they just didn't see a moose. I've walked a trail behind dozens of people that didn't see a rattlesnake, and I found one right next to the trail where everybody just walked right past too. So generally the general public probably won't see that much. If you know what you're looking for, you can see lots, but yeah, usually big groups of people don't do too well.
I'll tell you a story that 2 or 3 years ago, the club went over there as a group, and we were being led by the park naturalist, Mike Lavin, and we were pretty sure he just planted these things. We didn't go like 10 yards from the boat, and he had prairie warblers for us, and then we just stepped into the forest, and that's where he had planted the Massasauga rattler. We were pretty sure he did. It was right there.
Well, they're everywhere. We're used to a lot of Massasauga rattlers on the Bruce Peninsula and over on Manitoulin Island, but there's another island there called Fitzwilliam Island. I grew up in the commercial fishing industry, and we used to go in there all the time because we'd stay out a couple of nights when we were fishing, and we encountered a lot of rattlesnakes. In fact, the one little bay that's very, very protected there is called Rattlesnake Harbor, and yeah, you'd see lots of those.
Well, I want to get on to David Seaburn's question here, and you better get this one right, Dave. He says, great presentation. Any idea how widespread two-line salamanders are in Algonquin Park?
I think they're very, very widespread. So on the Herp Atlas, as David Seaburn's working on, it suggests that there's not a lot of squares with two-line salamanders marked on them. I haven't been to all the squares that are in Algonquin Park or every location in the park, but I've gotten pretty good at picking out the habitat for them. So generally these small rocky streams, and usually if I found the habitat, I can usually find a salamander in it. So I found them on the east side of the park, the sort of Highway 60 area, and the northwest corner of the park. So I'm pretty sure they're all throughout the park.
Susan Cote, you're raising your actual hand. Is that what? Okay, let's pin you.
One after the other. I wondered about the 5-line skink. Why is it called a skink? And do they have live young? And it's the young that have the blue tail, I think, right?
Yes. So a skink is a type of lizard. So we've got, lots of different kinds of lizards, and then there are different types of lizards. And skink is a type of lizard of the family Skingidae. So they've got smooth, shiny scales. There's some other sort of fine features that group them all as skinks. They do lay eggs, and the females protect the eggs. So they lay their eggs in a sort of a protected spot under a rock or a piece of wood, something like that. They excavate a little cavity and they lay their eggs in that cavity, and she will stay with them until they hatch. The young are born, and they're pretty small. They're maybe 4 or 5 centimeters long, and they do have a bright blue tail. And that bright blue tail serves as a distraction, primarily to animals that can see color, like us or birds. And a predator might grab that because they're maybe attracted to the blue tail. Like, oh, look at that. It's easy to pick out. It's easy to see. They will grab that. And the tail will actually detach. So it'll break off, and it'll continue to wiggle around for quite a while, like almost 10 minutes. It'll keep moving. So the predator will grab the tail, consume the tail, and the skink is very, very fast. It has run away, and it will actually grow its tail back. And it can maybe take maybe 6 weeks for it to grow back any amount of tail, but like half a tail could grow back in 6 weeks. So it's not ideal for the skink because there's, it's costly, metabolically costly for it to regenerate that. There's maybe fat stored in that tail, so it might hinder its ability to reproduce or grow anymore that year, but it sure beats being dead.
Would the new tail be blue?
It's usually sort of a grayish color with like a tinge of blue to it. Yeah.
Thank you. I have some of those around. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Susan. I see John Foster has his hand up, but I think I'll just take one more question from the chat first, and then we'll get to John. Question, this is from Bev Edwards. Question on INAT. This is a pretty technical question. How should a blue spotted salamander be designated? Ablystoma or Ablystoma unisexual? Can't remember the rest of it.
All right. So in our part of the world, this is a particularly challenging one. So, and this is a whole presentation itself. And if you want to learn more about it, I can connect you with an expert on this. But there's the blue spotted salamander, and then there is this variant that emerged a very long time ago that they're only females, and they need a packet of sperm from the male blue spotted salamander to stimulate reproduction in the unisexual population, the all-female population. They produce clones of themselves, and they don't actually take any of the genetic material from the male blue spotted salamander. So they just keep producing more clones of themselves, but they do need that sort of that sperm to kickstart the process. They're difficult to identify by eye, so telling the difference between the blue spotted and the unisexuals is very difficult, and in many cases it's not really that possible. So in our part of the world where I live, I don't feel terribly confident about calling it just a blue spotted salamander, or saying it's definitely a unisexual. I will usually call it, I'm more prone to calling it a unisexual with the note that it is undetermined. But yeah, that one's a weird little thing on iNaturalist that, yeah, it's a bug that isn't quite worked out yet, and it's basically impossible to tell without looking at chromosomes and the sizes of the cells in the animal, which, if you're taking a cell phone picture, that's not happening.
I think, people just don't realize how sexy herpetology is, and it's
a real shame.
Complicated sex lives, but that's a whole, like you say, it's a whole nother presentation, and probably an X-rated one. Yeah. So John Foster, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about eastern newts. I presume the red F is from the eastern newt, and I wondered what the best time to see a red F is. And do the eastern newts regularly lay their eggs in vernal ponds where the red F might be coming from?
All right. So the eastern newt is the adult. So they're about this big. They're actually about 10 centimeters long. They're a greenish color with a yellow belly and little red spots down the side of the back. They lay their eggs in the water. The adults live in the water, so they're basically an aquatic salamander. When they're young, have emerged from that tadpole stage, they've grown up, they've gone through metamorphosis. Their young actually leave the pond and they will live out on dry land for 2 to 7 years. So all they're doing out there is they're just eating and growing, and they're maybe dispersing away from their home wetland. So they usually emerge from that wetland in mid-August, early August, even to late August. So when I was doing my graduate work, I was doing a lot of salamander trapping as they cross the roads, and the peak eft season was, I think, like probably August 18th or something like that. If it rained that night and it was about that time of year, I caught 300 of them in one day. So they could be very, very abundant in some spots. The preferred habitat for those guys isn't so much vernal pools, but things like beaver ponds. So something that's a little bit more permanent, so the adults can live in it year round, so they can live in there, they can hibernate in the bottom over the winter, and then emerge and get started right away. Whereas those vernal pools, they fill up with water in the springtime. The salamanders like spotted and blue spotted might breed in there in the spring, and then the water will eventually dry up, hopefully not before the salamander larvae have metamorphosed and left. And then the pond's dry. So that means fish can't get established in there to eat the salamander larvae, among other things. But eastern newts are generally in beaver ponds and small ponds like that. So yeah, time of year to see an eft would be late summer, and habitat is near like a beaver pond, something like that. I find them under pieces of wood, things like that, around the edges of those ponds at that tip.
John, you also asked from the chat about mud puppies in Algonquin Park. I'm not sure if it's the place for them really, but any mud puppies there?
Yes. So for a long time, there was one record of one mud puppy from Lake of Two Rivers, and it was from the 1940s, and everybody thought it was a junk record. And it likely is. It's probably from a mislabeled specimen from some other lake that maybe sounds like Two Rivers or Deux Rivières. But since then, in probably about 6 years ago, there was one lake found in one part of the park to contain a very, very healthy population of mud puppies. And it was sort of in the southeast corner of the park, which makes sense because it's the lowest part of the park. So like the watershed is, there's not a big climb to get up to this lake. So it's a pretty gentle climb to be connected to a river system that has mud puppies.
Thanks
So
very much.
Algonquin's not a great place to go see a mud puppy, but there's a good spot to go see them, but only one good spot.
Thanks for the info.
And Catherine Houghton is asking what time of year you had that record haul of salamanders on your little road trip there.
All right. So the research that I was doing there, I had a drift fence, so a small, like knee-high.
I think she was thinking of when the road you walked with your wife.
It was April 6th, 2021.
Etched in your memory, eh?
Yes, yeah. Well, I had it on my little notes, but I think no. But yes, it was April 6th. Yeah. And then I think a week later we had a similar night as well. So it's just around the corner.
And there's some other interesting things in the chat. If you scroll through it, folks, Penelope Adams is telling us about the road that they close in Burlington during salamander mating season, and they look after the Jefferson salamanders. But a fascinating evening, a great topic. I'm sure a lot of people are surprised how fascinating herpetology can be. A lot of us knew that, but it may be a surprise for some. But the club is going to thank David by making a donation to the Algonquin Research Station. And maybe just to close off, you can tell us a little bit about the Algonquin Research Station, where it is, who's there, what goes on there.
All right. So I'm not specifically affiliated with the Algonquin Wildlife Research Station anymore, but I was a student researcher there for many years. So the Algonquin Wildlife Research Station was established in 1944 to be a research area and facility for scientists coming to Algonquin Park. So this is an area on the north side of the highway across from the Mew Lake campground, and it's actually a quite large area. There's a number of lab spaces and bunkhouses there where students and researchers come and stay for the summertime, sometimes in the wintertime. They carry out natural experiments out in the field, and there's a number of long-term research projects that happen out of that facility. So there's a small mammal research project that's been happening since the 1940s, which is amazing. There's a long-term turtle research project that's been happening since the 1970s on snapping and painted turtles. There's the Bat Lake Inventory of Spotted Salamanders, which is Patrick Muldown's project, so hopefully you get to hear about that. There's a number of bird and research projects that take place out of there. So it's a really, really amazing facility where researchers come to do their work in the best laboratory in the world, which is Algonquin Park. And it's also a place where field course students actually come to learn and do their own experiments over the summertime. So it's also a training place for young biologists. So you maybe remember earlier I lamented that that students spend way too much time in classrooms and not enough time outdoors. Well, the research station is helping to facilitate this this outdoor experience where they're actually getting a chance to do field work, that kind of thing. So it's a really, really amazing place, very near and dear to my heart, and it's a very worthwhile facility.
And is it pretty unique to Algonquin Park? Are there similar things in other national parks and provincial parks?
Yeah, so there's a number of other research stations. None of them are quite like the Algonquin Wildlife Research Station, but there's the Cubes Biological Research Station. So it's the Queen's University Biological Research Station in Kingston, or near Kingston. There's the Experimental Lakes area in northwestern Ontario. And there's a number of other research stations in Western Canada. So there are research stations throughout the world. They're not terribly common. They always operate on shoestring budgets. Oh, and then there's also the Harkness Laboratory of Fisheries Research in Algonquin Park too. I almost forgot. So this is a big MNRF fisheries focused research station as well. But there's a small number of them throughout the world. They're not necessarily affiliated with each other, but these are pretty important places. And in terms of where biologists get their real training, these are certainly among the important places.
Well, we can see the results in what you've done for us tonight. Just fascinating. So thanks very much, Dave. But before everybody leaves, we'll say goodnight to Dave. You're welcome to stay and we'll hang around here and look at some other things for about 5 or 10 minutes. But just thanks for a wonderful presentation. I'm going to remove your pin.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great night and enjoy spring.
And now I'm going to try and share my screen here. And usually when we have our monthly meetings, let's see here. See if I can get the full screen here. We have what we call sightings, where our members all stick their hands up and they tell us what they've been seeing as they go out and about. And that's a little more difficult to do, but not impossible. We've got, when we're on Zoom, we've got, I'm not going to stop at every photograph and say who took it, but we've got contributions here from Bob Codd, Deepthi Rajapakse, Paula Sheppard, Peter Huff. I may have forgotten Owen myself, hopefully I didn't forget anybody, but we'll just go through some of the things that they've seen in the last couple of weeks. And this is that flooded field that's down at the intersection of County Road 6 and the Tiny Flosstown line. I've started to, apparently the locals call it Hummelink Lake. It floods in the spring and it's on the property of the Hummelink farm. So, and was down there this morning, and the Tundra Swans have started to gather. These are all Tundra Swans, not trumpeters. And we had about 50 of them there this morning. Last year, I think my highest count at this spot was about 300. 2 years ago, at one day, I had about 500 Tundra Swans there. So it's a good area to visit all through this, about the next month or so, as a lot of the Tundra Swans, sometimes, apparently there were snow geese there earlier this morning. And of course, the ducks will start visiting here very soon as well. These are some of the trumpeters. I think Peter took these down at the Sal Park. There's a wood duck. It's the time of year when the ducks all start to find the open water, come back to us. Some buffleheads. This is a common golden eye taking off. Redheads are beautiful ducks that visit us as they pass through in the spring. A redhead male and female. This is over in Collingwood Harbor. You can see a bunch of the redheads, and there's a few ringnecks and greater scoppin there as well. There's some of the ringneck ducks showing off. And this is the little female ringneck duck over in Aurelia. This is a hybrid duck. I think it's a combination of an American black duck and a mallard. Red-breasted mergansers, the bad hairdo duck. And that's the male red-breasted merganser. There's another female. Peter Huff got some nice close-up looks of white-winged scoters when he was down in the Lake Ontario area. That's Peter's shots of white-winged scoters. And of course, wild turkeys are with us all year round. Bob Codd had just came back from Algonquin and got some great shots there. This is Bob's always amazed by how many birds feed on sumac, and this is a ruffed grouse feeding on sumac. This is is it a Cooper's, Bob? Or a Sharpie?
That's a sharpshin.
That's the sharpshin feeding on a starling.
Yeah.
This is a bald eagle down by Tiny Marsh. And there's been a little American coot that's been hanging out all winter at the, there's a great place in Collingwood they call the Birch Street. It's right beside their sewage treatment plant. And if you go there, you'll probably see about 1,000 mallards, but if you look closely, you'll always see a few other interesting little ducks there as well, like this American coot. There he is. There's he or she is again. And we ignore some of those common birds, but mourning doves are actually quite beautiful, I find. And Peter went down, I think last time we shared some of the photos, we had some of his owl photos, but this was a northern sawwood owl he was able to view down in the Lake Ontario area. We've still got a few snowy owls hanging about. And this was Bob Codd's photo. He was quite pleased to finally find a black-back woodpecker. This is a male black-back. The male has the yellow mark on his forehead, the female wouldn't have that. This was in Algonquin Park. You have to go up a little further north than where we are to see them. Another woodpecker, I think that's a downy, is it?
That's a downy, yeah.
This is a hairy woodpecker. They look almost the same, but one has a little larger bill than the other. A few other little plumage differences. This is a red-bellied woodpecker, and I think Gary Van Gelderen was all the call tonight. This is his red-bellied woodpecker at his feeders. Northern shrikes visit us in the winter, and there's still a few about if you look for them. Another northern shrike. Bob was also surprised. Bob Codd was up in Algonquin, and he was visiting the Canada jays there, and he was a little surprised to see that one of their favorite treats that the people hand out to them is cheese. And you wonder, there's some human beings that can't digest cheese, but apparently Canada jays have no problem digesting. In fact, they love it. Not sure.
I don't know that they don't have any problem digesting it. In fact, what I've read suggests that they probably do. But I think maybe the trade-off of a bit of diarrhea as opposed to all the fat content in cheese is worth it.
Oh, and you wonder, they stash a lot of their food under bark too, and maybe when they stash it, it partially digests it or something. More research is required. Bob, you better get on that. He certainly seems to like all that cheese. He's got his mouth full. But they do go for cranberries as well. Horned larks the spring is the time to look for them. They're pretty small birds, so they can flit through a field and not be noticed at all. But if you see something moving in the field, it might be a horned lark. There's one standing proud and free. And one of the highlights of the last month or so has been the Townsend solitaire that's been hanging around John Chalice's place in near Washago. If you go on eBird or on some of the bird alert sites, you'll find out exactly where to go. And John is I think he's graciously hosted about 400 birders there. They all come, and I think there's only one birder that missed seeing the bird. If you're willing to wait at least 20 or 25 minutes, the bird will show up for you. It's feeding on John's crabapple trees. And this is a bird which would be a little more common out in Western Canada, but a rare bird for Ontario. This was my first sighting of a hermit thrush over in Collingwood a few days ago. Robins are back this morning. Some of the fields had 50 robins in them. A little American tree sparrow. Yesterday I had my first song sparrow of the year over in Aurelia. Of course, red-winged blackbirds. All the swamps are getting noisy again with the beautiful red-winged blackbirds that come back to us this time of year. Still some pine siskins. They're a winter bird for us, but there's been some. This is the feeders at Y Marsh with the pine siskin on it. Bob was up. Another treat when you go to Algonquin is to see the pine martens. The Mew Lake garbage dump is a good spot to find them hanging out. I had a nice time with these two river otters in Tiny Township. And the great blue heron nests are there. I think somebody said they saw a heron on a nest today. So some of these nests will start to fill up over the next few days or a few weeks, anyways. Now into our further afield naturalists. Paula Sheppard's been down in Florida. She's been seeing some amazing birds and sending us back a few photos. This is a roseate spoonbill on the left and the white ibis on the right. The roseate spoonbill again. Beautiful birds. This is, what is it?
Wood stork.
A wood stork, okay. Is this the one? Let me see if I can get rid of my, I'm not sure if everybody sees this. I'm going to hide the floating because it's interesting on the bottom.
Looks like it's listening to an iPod to a, yeah.
Whoop, let me go back to it. Do you see his feet there?
Yeah.
Now, what is that? A lot of people get confused with birds because their knees, what we think are their knees, don't bend like our knees. They bend the other way. But what we usually think of their knees are actually their ankles. On most birds, like herons and that, what's actually their knees and their hips are tucked up inside all those feathers in their bodies. So when wood storks do this, they're actually just, they're resting. They bend their ankles and rest on their feet, big long feet. But when you think of most of these birds, normally they're actually always up on their tiptoes. Whereas this wood stork is just having a rest, bending those ankles to have a rest. Brown pelican, I'm not sure which tern that is.
It's like a royal tern.
Royal tern, I think, yep. And that's a snowy egret on the right. They're a little smaller than our great American egrets. I have seen them up here. Occasionally we get one, and the best way to tell them they've got the yellow feet instead of black feet like our American egrets. Black vultures we look for them as rare birds up here, but they're certainly more common down in Florida. They don't have the red head of our turkey vultures, and they've got those white feathers on their wingtips. This is a willet down in Florida that Paula saw, and of course we get some of these birds up here too, but I'm blanking on the name here. This is a sanderling. Ruddy turnstone. Laughing gulls. Everybody got excited when we had one laughing gull show up at the Barrie Harbor last year. Of course, down there in Florida, they're parking lot birds. They're everywhere. Beautiful birds. And Paula's seeing some birds that we will see here eventually, but she's seeing them sometimes 3 or 4 weeks ahead of us. The bluebirds, blue-gray gnatcatcher, northern mockingbird. These are all Paula's photos. And then Mary Rajapaksa is out in BC right now, and Mary considers the bald eagles her spirit animal. She's getting lots of them out there. She's having the time of her life. Bald eagles everywhere. Great blue herons out there as well. And she sent us this picture. We only get the ruby-throated hummingbird here in Ontario. This is a nice Anna's hummingbird. And I think that's it. So let me see if I can stop sharing. And we're back. So still three dozen people on the meeting or so. Thanks very much for coming, everybody. Anything else anybody want to say before we all say goodnight?
Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah, happy St. Patrick's Day.
Happy St. Patrick's Day to you all.
Yeah.
Happy bird hunting.
Where's your green, everybody? Have a good night. That was a very good presentation. Good.
Well, I'm sure one of the problems, although we all feel Irish on St. Patrick's Day, a lot of us feel Ukrainian today as well. So
Yeah,
hopefully
good background,
hopefully there's better days ahead.
for sure. Okay, well, thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night all, and happy birding.
Good night.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank
Night.
you very much.
Good night.
Good night.
Hang on.
Night, everyone.
Night.
Oh, I get out of full screen.